let me bring up Lois Kiley to talk about our speaker.
Thank you, Paul. And that was very eloquent.
Yes.
Passionate man.
Yes.
It's an honor to introduce Randall Gabrielan tonight. He's a man who really doesn't need an introduction in this neck of the woods, but I'm going to introduce him anyway. Randy has been a very good friend to the museum. We appreciate his wisdom and the recommendations that he's given us. He is the Monmouth County historian whose passion for New Jersey history, especially that of our beloved Jersey Shore, has inspired him to write numerous books and articles. And you can see over there on the table the display many of the books that he has written, and they are there for your review and purchase. Tonight he will share an overview of his latest book, The Birth of the Jersey Shore. He'll tell us about the movers and shakers who have made the shore what it is today. Following his presentation, he will be available for signing and sale of the copies. And right now, let's welcome Randall Gabrielan. Thank you, Randy. Can we use this?
Thank you, Lois. I'm going to start the program in a very unusual way because it's rare that prior to it I hear an impassioned talk such as Paul gave on why to save the tower. Who else wants to save the tower? A broader public than you might imagine. I'm the vice chair of the Monmouth County Historical Commission. We've given grants for the restoration of that tower. Modest grants, but still a good start. And I'll admit, when I first saw it, my thought was, oh my gosh, how is this going to be saved? But then again, I also saw the Eden Woolley house before it was moved, and I had a similar reaction to that. And look at the magnificent job that was done at the Eden Woolley house. The tower needs to be saved. It's a rare architectural type. As Paul said, there aren't very many towers left in Monmouth County. We know of 3, and one day this one will look as good as the other 2. It deserves your support, and I'm confident that it will get the Commission's support again. So let's take a look at Birth of the Jersey Shore. Everyone has a favorite shore feature. Maybe it's the beach. And yes, we do have beaches in New Jersey, and I disdain the affectation that says, oh, we go to the shore in New Jersey, not the beach. Or maybe it's the ocean, and I separate the ocean from the beach because we may take it for granted, but there are millions of people in the country that have never seen the ocean and are awed when they do. The water alone is a magnificent presence. And then there's the boardwalk, an entirely different culture, part of a broader shore culture that inspires and pleases so many, including those that simply live here and love it. What's my favorite historical topic? Structures. Well, we don't often associate structures with the shore. And one of the shortcomings of some of my books is the absence of people in favor of structures. So I've remedied that in this instance. This book is all about people. People that made the shore, made it interesting, made it the heart of our life and culture. There are 114 entries in here, including 4 couples, and 1 trio of brothers organized into 13 categories. I'm going to talk about a relative handful of them tonight, but I think it will give you a pretty good impression of what the book is about. One of the challenges was selection. You can write about an enormous number of contributors to the shore. These choices are mine, and I think they make a good representation. Some are figures that simply deserve greater familiarity. Some of those names are instantly recognizable. There are 59 illustrations for those 114 entries. About half of them are people, and half of them are objects representing the people. Why? That was the publisher's choice. and I've worked with enough editors over the years knowing when not to make issue. So let's take a look at our first individuals. I'm going to start with the life-saving service. Why? Because the shore was a very dangerous place. If you don't know what you're doing now, it can still be dangerous. In fact, in the early years, the shore wasn't occupied, wasn't inhabited because it was simply too dangerous. It was especially dangerous for mariners. You've heard New Jersey referred to as the graveyard of the Atlantic. Well, it's one of about 3 or 4 graveyards of the Atlantic. But we were late in securing a rescue service. Now, the man on the left, shown in a POC photograph, is William Newell. He's generally credited with being the father of the life-saving service. And on the right is a life car representing Joseph Francis, who developed what is arguably the most important life-saving device, that life car. So what did Newell do, and why is he the father, and how many fathers might the shore life-saving service have? Well, when he got to Congress, he secured an appropriation attaching it to a lighthouse bill to make a life-saving service, or a modest start. Well, so had another congressman the year before, 1847 to Newell's 1848, but it didn't get spent. So those who have worked with government know the idea is not to get an appropriation, it's to get the money spent. So how did it get spent? Well, there was another individual, a Douglas Ottinger, that secured the building of the first 5 life-saving structures on the shore. On the other hand, they were just little shacks, totally inadequate, and the life-saving service took a deserved bad rap for decades. Finally, in 1871, after numerous complaints and unnecessary suffering, the life-saving service was professionalized. A Sumner Kimball became the first supervisor of the professional life-saving service. So it really took a team. Newell had an interesting career. He was later governor, but I hope you'll read about him. Before there was a life-saving service, individuals, the few that resided on the shore, were often volunteer helpers, such as Captain Thomas Bond, who began as a watchmaker in New York. He came to Long Beach Island when the place was deserted, bought the Philadelphia house and turned it into the Long Beach house. He catered to sportsmen, and he rescued 400 survivors from the wreck of the Georgia. He kept them in his hotel. He was unpaid. He secured a judgment against the ship owner. On the other hand, he failed to collect. So when you have a case, the idea is not to have a good case, not to have a good lawyer, not to win, but to collect. He was a true hero. One of the vital guardians of our shore is the lighthouse. And George Gordon Meade, a graduate of West Point of 1835, began as a Seminole Indian fighter. He resigned. I guess there weren't too many opportunities in the Army in the 1830s, but he rejoined in 1842 in the Engineer Corps. He specialized in lighthouses. He designed the lighthouse in Delaware Bay, Absecon. He's often credited with Cape May, but he only supervised construction there. And the most famous one, Barnegat, perhaps the most recognizable symbol of the Jersey Shore. He's better known for his military exploits, including organizing the defenses at Gettysburg. This bust of him is mounted at the lighthouse on Long Beach Island. Some individuals here are chosen for what they represent, such as Captain John Jeffries, an old-time family on the shore in Great Egg Harbor ports. He owned a ship called the 21 Friends. An unusual name? Well, it was sponsored by 21 Quakers. It was wrecked. The crew was rescued, but the ship didn't sink. It sailed on the ocean for 2 years. Washed ashore in Ireland, where they rescued the ship, refitted it, and gave it a second life on the ocean. Jeffrey's monument is on the National Register of Historic Places, which is kind of rare, and it's an attractive monument, and I thought a good representation for a little-told chapter of our maritime history. There are 3 presidents in the book. I think in this area, especially now with your very fine exhibition at the museum, we are familiar with those who vacationed at Long Branch, but I'm not going to ask the question, who was the first to vacation at the Jersey Shore, because the answer is on the screen. Well, he's not in the Long Branch crew, so where did he go? Well, Cape May. Franklin Pierce is an interesting character. He's one of the most obscure presidents. There are 4 of his residences open to the public in New Hampshire, his native state, and one of them promotes the fact that he was the most obscure president. So what was he doing in Cape May? Well, Cape May was a Washington, Baltimore, and Philadelphia resort. Why? Because the only way you could get there was by water. So Franklin Pierce vacationed at the Congress Hall Hotel in 1855. And here's what was said about his visit there. While much of early Cape May's patronage was from Washington, the distance may have appeared great for a sitting president, as there was no capability at the time to respond quickly to control emerging crises. After 3 bureau chiefs in the Department of the Interior resigned, the New York Times grumbled on July 6, 1855, "While the country is thus losing important officers at a critical moment, it has also lost its president. President Pierce is at Cape May. For practical purposes, he might as well be at Cape Horn, since he cannot by any possibility proceed to the appointment of successors for his retiring corps without the advice of his cabinet." Well, how did he earn his obscurity? Well, he was a severe Lincoln critic. He was a heavy drinker. He died in 1869 of cirrhosis of the liver, but still is immemorialized as our 14th president. One should not minimize the importance of presidential history at the shore by failing to include Mary Lincoln, who came here by herself in 1861 to Long Branch. Long Branch had been a thriving, growing resort before that, but when the First Lady came to Long Branch that year, the entire country was focused on her trip. Newspapers examined and reported on her every move. There couldn't have been a better piece of advertising for Long Branch than the appearance of Mary Lincoln. What other presidents do we have? Well, Grant perhaps is among the most prominent or famous of the Long Branch travelers. He owned 2 homes there. One provided by his good friend, the publisher George W. Childs, who's also featured in the book. He enjoyed his stay. He mixed with the public. He circulated around in the many well-known and traveled drives surrounding Long Branch. And he was sometimes credited with being the first to use Long Branch as a summer White House, but not really. That's a working term, and the earliest usage I found for it is Benjamin Harrison, again at Cape May. In fact, Grant delayed some of his trips to Long Branch until his Washington work was done. The president who got around the most was Woodrow Wilson. Well, he had a head start. He was governor of New Jersey before he was president and traveled the state regularly. He's pictured here in the Monmouth County Fair with a couple other key fair figures, Melvin Rice at the left, and to Wilson's left, Amory Haskell, Monmouth County's most prominent horseman. The officer on the far right is not Haskell's brother, despite any similarity in their appearance. Wilson was president of Princeton before he was elected governor in 1910. He won successfully a three-way race in 1912. The Republicans had been united. He might not have made it. He was famous at the shore for conducting his 1916 re-election campaign at Shadow Lawn. That was the front porch campaign. Wilson felt obliged to stay here in view of the war in Europe. One other president who is not in the show deserves mention, and that's Benjamin Harrison, who is a friend of John Wanamaker, who we may recall as a retailer, who's featured in the book and has an unusual presence at the shore. He was prominent at two places, Island Heights in Ocean County, where he founded a summer camp, and Cape May Point, then known as Seagrove. His friends there provided him with a house, but President Harrison didn't think it would be appropriate for him to accept the gift of a house. So he had the bright idea, or they had the bright idea, of putting it in the name of Mrs. Harrison. Well, that didn't sit too well either, but we have an idea now why we may examine the finances of first ladies. Well, eventually Harrison paid for the place. One of the topics in the book is founders. This is Bertram Mayo, who one could say had a national operation, but that wouldn't exactly speak proud of his work because he was a real estate operator and he got across the country fleeing from one unsuccessful venture to another, starting in California, moving eastward, winding up in New Jersey. He secured, or had secured, a 2,000-acre tract of scrub pine in secret in 1914. This was done for the New York Tribune newspaper, which had a subscription promotion scheme. You take a 6-month subscription and you could buy a lot for $19.60. Sounded like a great deal. They had great promotional material that showed a waterfront resort with nice amenities. Problem was, when you saw your lot, you weren't near the shore, you were on the other side of the railroad. And there was no safe way to cross the railroad. Oh, and even so, if you wanted to build, you were going to need to buy a regularly priced lot in order to put up a cabin. So this was not an auspicious start for what became, in 1916, the borough of Beechwood. However, they revere him as a founder. Was he a founder or a slick real estate operator? Maybe something of both. Unfortunately, he died only a few years later in 1920. Now, Lieutenant Edward Farrow, another West Point graduate with the class of 1876, also started out as an Indian fighter. He was a writer. And he wound up at the shore, perhaps while making engineering investigations for the Army. And he purchased a tract of 4,076 acres. But let's see exactly what he was doing with it. His plans for the retirement community began to take shape after he bought a 4,070-acre tract near Bayville in 1886, on which he laid out a 300-acre residential section in 1887, reserving the remainder for hunting, and then named the settlement Barnegat Park, which he promoted as the new Army and Navy seaside home. Retired military was his target audience. While the military was his target market, lots were also sold to other acceptable persons for a small cash deposit with the balance due in monthly or quarterly payments. Farrow's many complicated real estate transactions were often in the name of his associate, John B. Larner. The underfinanced venture, bankrupt by 1892, immersed Farrow in litigation issues that resulted in trial by court-martial, a struggle he overcame after it was ascertained that the case was not a military matter. After a suspicious fire destroyed most of the public buildings on October 21, 1893, another blaze burned the Pines, his hotel, on July 5, 1895. While Farrow remained committed as a resident, he sought rescue as early as 1905, when he started to call on others, but it was never a success in his lifetime. On the other hand, eventually it became known as the Pinewald section of Berkeley Heights. No, not Berkeley Heights, Berkeley Township. And you can still see some of the original military retirement community there. Now, Michael Ortley is a strange historical figure, or he had a strange experience. He's the first of three of the next four figures being names on the land, and of course, in his instance, it's the familiar Ortley Beach. What is this historical oddity? Well, it is now hard to keep the water out of Ortley Beach. We recall what happened during Hurricane Sandy, and I'm sure it's going to happen again someday. But Ortley, Michael could not keep his waterway open. Here's what happened. In 1812, Cranberry Inlet, which opened to the shore from the Toms River, was closed by a storm. Ortley, who I thought was protecting his family property, actually bought it with the idea of recreating that opening, which he tried with great exertion, having secured authority from the New Jersey State Legislature. He began in 1816, and 4 years later, his inlet was open, and a storm closed it after a single night. Poor Michael Ortley. Eventually it became a resort that was open for gunning parties. That's what they called hunters in those days from New York. And eventually the Berea Beach was developed. If you ask the first resort on the New Jersey shore on Long Beach Island, they'll probably say Tucker's Beach for the Tucker family, Reuben Tucker. Tucker's Beach is now underwater, and his son, Ebenezer Tucker, also has his name on the land, an existing part of the land, Tuckerton section of Southern Ocean County. It was earlier known as mid of the shore, or Clamtown. At one time, it was an important mercantile and shipping area. And Tucker is the subject of an interesting story that he threw a big party in 1798 in order to get the locals to rename their town for him. Well, stories have a way of getting a life of their own. And it was named for Ebenezer. However, if you do your research and look at the historical record, the renaming was prior to the party. Sometimes when you have a story that's more interesting with the facts, a lot want to go with the story. I think that's a Hollywood maxim. Now, the name on the screen is James V. Lafferty. He's represented by his famous figure, Lucy the elephant. Lucy, he is really another one of those icons that would be in the top 5 of Jersey Shore images. How did he come about? Lafferty had an idea of creating a figure to use for real estate promotion. And he designed this elephant. He patented the design, had a couple of others built, including one that was far larger than this on Coney Island, the elephant colossus, another in Cape May, the Light of Asia, and he contributed a word to the language that you may not have a use for ever, but know that buildings shaped like animals are called or classified as zoomorphic architecture. So his development became South Atlantic City. That's its actual location. We know it better as Margate Borough, which it was renamed in 1900. And his figure was bought by an Anton Gertsen in 1887. And it is believed that one of the Gertsen children named the figure Lucy. In the 1960s, this was a seriously dilapidated building. It was thought it might be lost. It was restored through great local exertion and fundraising, moved 2 blocks in 1970 to its present location, and in 1976 was declared a National Historic Landmark, the highest honor for a historic designation. Now, you probably recall I referred to the elephant as he, named Lucy. Well, the elephant has tusks. That makes it a male. On the other hand, we'll allow the young Gertsen girl a little artistic license in naming the figure for a female. George Henry White is the founder of Whitesboro in Middle Township around 1900. It's not a particularly proud story because there was an anti-African-American campaign in Cape May at that time, and they wanted to remove black residents from the town, where they had the idea it was fine to work in our hotels, keep the business active actually, but don't live here. The locals, inspired by the Reverend J.H. Fishburne, who knew White, called him up from North Carolina, where White had the distinction of being the last black congressman from the Reconstruction era. He was from the North Carolina 2nd District, which was organized to keep the blacks in one district. Whiteboro has sort of lost its identity. You can still see traces of the town. There used to be an adage, there are no whites living in Whitesboro. It's no longer true, but White is one of those figures that deserves to be remembered. Another name on the land is Loveland, mainly for a bridge, as there were many Loveland family members in that Point Pleasant area. However, there seems to be no contemporary reference to a Loveland town back in the day when there were many Lovelands there. I think it was named after the fact to give the bridge an appropriate name, and I've offered an award of a free Red Bank book for anyone who could find a contemporary reference to Loveland Town. not connected with the bridge. Dr. Jonathan Pitney may not be too well known, but the place he founded is among the most prominent on the shore. He was a physician, born in Mendham, New Jersey, practiced medicine on Staten Island for 2 years. He was active in public life, a member of the 1844 State Constitutional Convention, and eventually he settled in Atlantic County. He must have had a great view of his house looking all the way down to the shore, and figured the shore would be a great health resort if you could get people there. And there's the rub. How are you going to get people across a flat, sandy New Jersey in order to settle Pitney's great idea? Well, you build a railroad. If you can convince someone to pay for it and design it, but he did. He found engineer Richard B. Osborne. He convinced some Philadelphia investors to build the Camden and Atlantic Railroad in 1854. They got people to the beach, which became famed almost immediately as Atlantic City. Here we have two people that are really connected. William Lightfoot Price was an architect who began as a carpenter. He was a Quaker, and he used his religious connections to help build business. He was active in the arts and crafts movement, and he was a proponent of the single tax movement active in the day. He too deserves more recognition. He had 3 major Atlantic City hotels, and he experimented with new materials. In 1902, he built the Marlborough. He used reinforced concrete in 1906 for the Blenheim, the 2 hotels being joined as one unit. And at that time, the Blenheim was the largest building of reinforced concrete. Later, he designed the Traymore, the pictured hotel, built in 1915. It endured until 1972, and it's probably more prominent now for its destruction rather than its life. It was pictured in the film Atlantic City and can still be seen on YouTube, imploded by 3 explosions. It was the largest reinforced concrete building of its day. What's often interesting with architects is the relationship with their clients. And in this instance, the client was Josiah White. First a farmer, and then he bought a boarding house, the Luray, in 1888, which he expanded in 1892, and then built a new Luray in 1895. Then he teamed with Price on the aforementioned hotels. He had 2 sons, one became a judge, and one was successful in business. Another category in the book is historians and preservationists. I have a couple of preservationists in the presentation. I've included Henry Phipps, but he wasn't really a preservationist, but Island Beach is known as the former Phipps estate. Phipps was born in Philadelphia. He was associated with Andrew Carnegie in the steel business. He gave many public benefactions, donated considerably to healthcare and hospitals, and he acquired a 10-mile strip off Ocean County, which he used for a summer settlement. It would have been a great public facility when the New Jersey legislature passed a bill to buy it in 1926. But Governor Moore vetoed the bill. New Jersey was never a well-financed state, and Governor Moore wasn't in the spending mood. Or maybe his sponsor, Frank Hague, thought, oh, gee, Island Beach would be too far for Jersey Cityites to get to. In any event, Phipps planned to develop his property. But Unfortunately, he died in 1930. The Great Depression was underway, and the plans foundered. There were many squatters there. It had informal recreational use, and eventually the state did acquire the property in 1953. One of our most visited parks, and I think today it's unimaginable to think of a New Jersey without Island Beach State Park. After his death, the place was run by his key associate, Francis Parkman Freeman, who's also featured in the book. Carolyn Pitts may not be too well known elsewhere on the shore, but to make it short and simple, she saved Cape May. She was educated at the University of Pennsylvania, had a degree in fine arts, was a Fulbright scholar, and started her career as an art school instructor. And then she became an architectural historian with the National Park Service. She came to Cape May after the 1962 storm in order to study and survey the town's architecture. Because many in Cape May, the place having been passed by as a resort, thought history would be a good aid to their redevelopment and rebirth. It was and is, but unfortunately there were some in Cape May that would have been satisfied with faux history. You go down to the Washington Street Mall in Cape May, it looks like an old shopping street, but it's really a modern reconstruction. Carolyn Pitts wrote the Cape May Guide. It's still being used as an aid to restoration in Cape May. And she did the study work for 25% of the buildings in her time that are National Historic Landmarks. A great figure in the town. I also recount the career of the Reverend Carl McIntyre, who has been called a preservationist, but a preservationist for his own aims, to relocate buildings, to make part of his hotel complex. He was an odd character, to be reasonably kind, got into lots of difficulty with regulatory, political, and even spiritual matters, but still his story is recounted in the book. There are a number of entertainers in the book, including Arthur Pryor, the creator of the first Asbury Park sound. He began in St. Louis as a trombone player. He played in John Philip Sousa's band. And then when Pryor's father died in 1902, he took over his father's band. Pryor was a composer, mainly of marches and band music, but also three light operas. He slowed down and opted for elective office in 1933 and was elected a freeholder of Monmouth County. He served only one term, was defeated in his re-election bid, and sort of slipped into retirement. He was planning a comeback in 1942, was going to have a July 4th band concert, but unfortunately he died shortly before. Joseph and George Albert are represented by Albert Hall in Waretown. The two brothers were from Sayreville. In 1932, they bought 56 acres for $200. They built a cabin they called the home place. It was more or less a hunting lodge, but the locals played music there on Saturday night for their own amusement. They attracted visitors, so many that they overwhelmed the place and needed their own venue. They moved to the Waretown auction, which burned in 1992. They had another temporary facility in a school. And then the Pinelands Cultural Center was opened and dedicated by a nonprofit on January 7th, 1997. And it still thrives. There's a concert there of bluegrass and country music just about every Saturday night. admission, maybe half the cost of a movie. It's a great cultural facility. I'm not a fan of this music, but I enjoyed myself immensely there. I recommend going. Now, is Ware Town the shore? Well, perhaps it's at the nexus of the shore and the pinelands. Remember, in the early days, the shore wasn't occupied, and many of those who traded on the shore, who sailed from the shore, actually lived on the nearby pines. And I think that makes a great connection with the shore. There are 4 athletes in the book. Years ago, some Manahawkin historians were putting on an ardent campaign for getting Doc Kramer elected to the Hall of Fame. So to honor him, I don't think he's going to make it in the hall. I put him in the book and examined why he is not in the fame and speculated as to whether or not he'll make it. He had a long career. He played from 1929 to 1948, 296 batting average. That's pretty good. Over 2,700 hits. That's excellent. On the other hand, his figures are very good, but not quite great. And the bar has been raised in recent years. In addition, some of Kramer's best times were played during the war years when the sport was considered diluted. So he is honored locally with a significant street named for him. He's remembered in the book. I'm not going to get too involved in baseball because I think every fan has a personal choice as to how can someone be kept out of the Hall of Fame? My choice, Gil Hodges. Dan Rice, born in New York City, left home to enter show business. His biography is called Dan Rice, the most famous person you've never heard of. Well, how could he be so famous and not be heard of? Well, fame was fleeting. This guy was organized a circus. He was called a clown at a time when a clown was not the terrifying figure that clowns are today, but more of a social commentator and political activist. Rice earned and lost a few fortunes. He wintered in Girard, Pennsylvania, where they still lionize him as a great figure. Rice wrote an autobiography, which is filled with myths, many of his own making. And after he died around 1900, he fell into obscurity. The book is by David Carolyn, very well researched and written. Will he ever regain his fame? I don't know, but he deserves to be remembered. Nate Salisbury is another entertainment figure. He served in the Civil War, claimed he came out of the war with $20,000 that he earned through gambling and poker playing. Was this a fabrication? Perhaps we'll never know. But we do know he was affable, had a successful career on the stage, and then founded Salisbury's Troubadours. He met William Cody, better known as Buffalo Bill. And he was the promoter, Salisbury was the promoter behind the William Cody Wild West show. Earned a lot of money. Settled for the summer on Liberty Street in Long Branch, where he built a home next to his manager, Frank Meador, in 1882. In 1900, as he was winding down his career, Salisbury bought the former East End Hotel in the northern section of town, and he built a house colony as a retirement project for investment. It was known as a reservation. The houses About 10 of them were named for Indian tribes, and they were quite an attractive colony for a while. Unfortunately, as we know, the shore is a very exposed place. They fell one by one. Only one was left in modern times, and it is now the headquarters of the Seven Presidents Park. John Frederick Peto creates an unusual opportunity for New Jersey. The ability to visit an artist in his home and studio. Peto was born in 1854 in Philadelphia. He exhibited at the Pennsylvania Academy of Fine Arts. He was self-taught. He painted in a number of styles. The best known of his styles is trompe-l'oeil or fool the eye, where his painted images look like actual objects mounted on the wall. Peto was a friend of William Harnett, who was a better known practitioner of that style. Peto came to Island Heights in 1887 as a cornet player. He continued to paint, didn't exhibit while he was didn't exhibit much at Island Heights, and he died in 1907 and fell into obscurity. His paintings were often had his signature covered up and replaced with Harnett's. Their work was so difficult to distinguish. But when a scholar was visiting the Peto home, he noticed that some of the objects on paintings attributed to Harnett were actually there in the home. It was so well preserved after his family stayed on. And this led to the resurrection of Peto's reputation. Died in 1907, but didn't have his first one-man exhibition until 1949. This house has practically indefinable quality for historic properties. When you go there, you can actually feel and sense the presence of the owner. It's in Island Heights. I would recommend a visit. Dorothy Parker represents the writers. She was born in 1893 in the Henry Rothschild House on Ocean Avenue in Long Branch. She spent much of her life regretting being a native New Jerseyan because she was so well tied to the New York literary scene, notably the Algonquin Round Table. Her principal output was stories and satire. She had a biting sense of humor that often crossed the border into caustic. She married Edwin Parker. Their marriage did not endure long, 1917 and 1922, but she kept his name, moved to Hollywood, wrote for film. She was a radical as a youth. She had two passions: her dogs and martinis, not necessarily in that order. She unhesitatingly violated no animal constraints by taking her dogs everywhere. They were obviously smaller than this 80-pound creature. She died in 1967, left her estate to Martin Luther King for distribution to the NAACP. In 1992, she was honored with a postage stamp that had its first day ceremony at West End Park, not far from her birthplace, which is now destroyed, but there is mounted on the street a landmark plaque denoting its significance to women's literature. Dr. Emlyn Physick was born in 1855. He was the grandson of Philip Singh Physick, a noted surgeon. Emlyn, however, never practiced. He earned his money the old-fashioned way. He inherited it. Thus, he was able to spend his career as a land investor. and a businessman. He built this stick-style house in conjunction with his mother. He was a sportsman, a clubman. He became the head of the First National Bank of Cape May, earned the disdain of some locals by closing the bank without the authority of the board. He died in 1919, and his place was saved and is now the home of the Mid-Atlantic Center of the Arts. He's always referred to as Dr. Physic, but I don't think they tell the story there that he never really practiced. In any event, he built one of the great houses of Cape May County, and we're fortunate that it's open to the public. Another businessman or pair of men were in not such an honorable profession. John Chamberlain and Phil Daly were gamblers. Chamberlain was the first of them. He was probably the owner of the gambling hell on 25th Street, which was its reference in the press. But he was very well liked and respected by those in his trade, because Chamberlain's modus operandi was free spending and the care and feeding of those necessary to keep under his control. They included not only the law, but also reporters. His fare was Epicurean, while alcohol flowed freely. A New York Herald writer, while reporting for an article titled Gambling in New York on August 19, 1870, was effusive in his description of the 10 divisions of gambling in the city when he placed Chamberlain in the top class by himself. He claimed John was as handsome a man there is in the metropolis, middle stature, compactly built, with an almost perfect head, abundantly covered with fine black silken hair, with small features. Chamberlain was never seen to frown and was one of the best-natured of men. Well, unfortunately, business caught up with him, and later in the 1870s, he became insolvent. He moved to the District of Columbia. He did not lose a beat. He reopened restaurants and a hotel there and earned a fine reputation. He also had a place in Fortress Monroe, Virginia, a big military installation, where the Hotel Chamberlain was a highly regarded facility. His local operation was taken over by Phil Daly, who began his career as a constable in Philadelphia. Now, he probably saw that those on the other side of the law were eating better than he was, so finding gambling preferable, he took over Chamberlain's, founded the Pennsylvania Club, where his motto was a square deal. He was known for his integrity. He catered to the high rollers, wouldn't let the locals in. But still, you may make a lot of friends with such a fine public posture, but no doubt a few enemies as well. He was shot in 1888. He survived, but was never the same. He built 2 houses on Chelsea Avenue, occupied one of them with his wife, who was an ardent Roman Catholic and actually had a chapel in her residence. He died in 1910. Here's another couple. Josephine Shaw Hoey, born in 1824, emigrated from Liverpool with her father, who was a musician. Hoey was her second marriage, courted by John from the audience while she was on the stage. She retired for a spell, but returned at the behest of James Wallach, a great shore acting figure whose home, I believe, was right here in Ocean Township rather than the Long Branch, which he's traditionally associated with. She owned her own costumes, which was the custom of the time. Probably didn't have to sew them either, because John gave her a very ample costume budget. She retained title to the New York house. Unfortunately, it didn't save her from what I'll get into in a moment. She was known for her restrained beauty, which I think is well depicted in this illustration. John, represented by his gardens, was born in 1825 in Ireland. He became associated with Alvin Adams in the express business. That was the facility for handling the delivery of small packages and, more importantly, specie in its day. In 1862, he began accumulating a very large spread in Long Branch, which is with his first 48.5 acres. He named it Hollywood. He built a hotel because he was getting so many visitors to the immaculate and artistic grounds he laid out. Then he added cottages, large houses for rent. Unfortunately, he secured a lot of debt, got involved in financial irregularities, was forced out of the Adams firm, a complicated story beyond the ambit of this work. He died in 1892, and unfortunately, Josephine lost the New York house. William Sandless, born in Shrewsbury, Pennsylvania, began as a carpenter, moved to New York City as an alcoholic beverage salesman. He became a lessee at Ferdinand Fish's Highland Beach development. That's in the northern section of Seabright, where Sandless built an excursion resort. Excursion resort was one that catered to day trippers. You can come and go in the same day. He attracted enormous crowds. The resort was also named Highland Beach for the community. It became famed for his bamboo garden, which he made with plants that he brought back from Jamaica in a 1908 trip. He lost his wife, unfortunately, on that trip. As a 50-year-old widower, he courted the telephone girl at the Hotel Gerard in New York for 2 years. They eventually married, even though she was half his age. He must have been very convincing. Highland Beach eventually evolved to a beach club. The land was taken over by the government as part of the Sandy Hook facility. There is one building left there, the former Sandless residence. It's the subject of an ongoing preservation campaign where the fate is up in the air. Hubert Templeton Parson is a sad story. He enjoyed enormous early success. In 1892, he became a bookkeeper for Frank W. Woolworth. By 1916, he was running the company and assumed the presidency on Woolworth's death in 1919. He married Maisie Gask, a seamstress. In 1918, he bought the Shadow Lawn estate, the original Shadow Lawn, which had a long history and multiple owners. The place was destroyed by fire on January 7th, 1927. Parson rebuilt it, bigger and grander than ever. He hired Horace Trumbauer for a magnificent Beaux-Arts edifice that was called at times the Versailles of America. He aimed for social prominence. Unfortunately, he didn't obtain it. At his big housewarming in 1930, hardly anyone came. Parson was subject to Woolworth's mandatory retirement age. He lost his salary. Now, this shows the difference between income and wealth. Eventually, he lost the house in 1938 for a tax sale. 2 years later, the furnishings were auctioned in a famed sale. 2 weeks after the auction, Parson died. And the house went through a number of incarnations, and as most of us know, it is now the main building of the Monmouth University campus. The picture on the right is one of the fancy lavatories. We don't often get to see them, especially on screen. Ray Stillman was a real estate salesman in Eatontown, or at least that was the best known part of his career. He began studying agriculture at Rutgers and farmed in Eatontown. He raised produce. But he went into the real estate business when he found that real estate people at the time didn't know anything about farms. He became very successful with it. His most prominent and successful and enriching purchase was Shadowbrook, the mansion of Ernest Fanstock, who's also in the book. But he's a sure person because he was one of the early developers of a lagoon community, the type of places that were so much in the news after Sandy, when so many of them were overwhelmed. And here's a good picture of an early lagoon. Basins that were made from landfill where they sold inexpensive houses. This one is Shelter Cove in Barnegat Bay in Toms River, developed in 1939, when you could get a place there for anywhere from $1,950 to $2,950. And of course, after the war, these lagoon communities just blossomed. Here's one that's in there for a lighter note. James Algor was a carpenter, settled in Seabright. He wanted to move to the other side of the river and bought the house at 1 Rumson Road, immediately after the bridge at the time. He opened an ice cream parlor. He wanted to install a couple of bowling lanes. Now, this was before zoning regulations, and got into a spat with the local authorities who didn't exactly think this was an appropriate facility for Rumson. He hung some ladies' underwear on a clothesline as a protest. They were seized. There was a legal case ensuing from the fight. He was run in and out of jail. And he built these fences, spike fences, in front of his house in order to state his causes, most of them against the locals, some of them socialist in nature. There are many of these cards to choose from. I like this one because it illustrates my favorite saying. The poor who steal go to prison, while the rich go to Europe. Al Gore eventually wound up in the insane asylum. This was a dreadful assault on our First Amendment. I'm going to include two business people from the scientific field, linking them Rudolf Goldschmidt on the left, a German born in 1876 who experimented and succeeded with radio telegraph. In May of 1912, that tower was built in the Tuckerton area. There was some early contact with Europe in 1913, and then the next year there was a celebrated conversation via wireless between Woodrow Wilson and Kaiser Wilhelm. But that year the war began in Europe, and the facility came under close government scrutiny. And when we entered the war in 1917, it was taken over by the government. It was seized as alien property and transferred to the American Radio Company. In World War II, our government used it for another purpose, the detection of U-boats. That tower was 800 feet tall, and at the time was the tallest structure in the Western Hemisphere. It was taken down in 1955. The wires were supported on 3 massive concrete blocks. which are still standing. Don't want to get too involved in demolishing reinforced concrete, and they'll probably remain there forever in the Mystic Islands development. Marconi is pictured on the left. He was born in 1874, and by 1895, he was making radio transmissions of 1.5 miles in distance. His successful distance transmitted increased steadily, and in 1899, he came over here to report from Twin Lights on the America's Cup race. This was going to be the first ship-to-shore transmission. However, the race was delayed because of Admiral Dewey's naval parade. So the naval parade was the first reported event. He increasingly distanced his transmissions, including one from Glace Bay, Nova Scotia, an island off Canada to Europe. And then the next year, 1903, from Wellfleet, Cape Cod to Europe. And then in 1913, a communication between President Wilson and the King of England. He built a communications center in Wall Township, generally known for the nearby town of Belmar. It was taken over by the American government in World War I. Marconi became an officer in the Italian army, served as a diplomat for his country, and in 1909 was a co-winner of the Nobel Prize for Physics. So that concludes the visual presentation. If one wonders who else will you find in the book, well, I'll mention a handful. In the entertainment field, yes, Bruce Springsteen is in there, so is Clarence Clemens, and the great organist at Ocean Grove, Gordon Turk. From the world of art, you'll find Brian Hanlon, New Jersey's sculptor, and Theodore Davis, who worked not far from here. Maritime figures, James P. Allaire, known for his Howell works, but his major career was in the maritime industry. Charles Hankins, a legendary builder of wood Seabright skiffs, and Captain Charles Irwin. We have some public officials, including Senator Beatleston, who could have been governor, Nucky Johnson, Congressman Jim Howard, and Oliver Huff Brown. The latter not too well known, but perhaps you visited his theater library in Spring Lakes. With two spiritual figures, the well-known Reverend Elwood Stokes from Ocean Grove, his statue there making him a very visible presence, and the Reverend Michael Glennon, who nearly single-handedly built the Catholic Church on the Jersey Shore. And a few writers, including Robert Louis Stevenson, who did not write Treasure Island on his visit to Manasquan. Richard Harding Davis, perhaps the most famous journalist of his day and now almost totally forgotten, and Stephen Crane. There are quite a few here. I hope you'll enjoy the book, and perhaps I've whetted your curiosity at least for a few questions. Yes?
Where was Doc Kramer from?
Where he was from Manahawkin. Yes.
You made my day or night.
Really? I don't do that too often. Just from a book presentation.
Early, I didn't know what to expect here tonight, but early in your presentation, you mentioned Captain John Jeffries. My name is Jim Jeffries, and Captain John Jeffries is my great uncle. I'm from Cape May County, Ocean City, so that's the connection there. And I melted when you mentioned his name. And I have that photograph in my stuff about him. The second thing is you mentioned about the railroad going into Atlantic City. On my mother's side, my great-great-grandfather, Thomas Reeves, was the engineer that brought the first train into Atlantic City on July 7th, 1877. So you made my day. Thank you.
Well, I'm glad I did. And when you heard there were going to be 114 people of the shore, you didn't think Jeffries was going to be one of them. The likelihood was you probably never even considered it. But I'm glad you're pleased. As I said during the presentation, worthy of remembrance. Anyone else? Yes, Lois.
When I moved to Oakhurst, and I think it was 1990, I lived on Dover Avenue, and across the street was a tiny house on a very small parcel of land. And the owners told me that the land was, they acquired the land as a result of a subscription to the paper. And so I guess it's the subscription that you mentioned earlier. Were there many houses?
Oh, yeah. With reference to this subscription scheme in it was Ocean Township, right? Yeah, there were many of them. And I heard one person say with respect to one of these affairs in Howell Township, the Maxim area, oh, well, gee, it's no big deal. There were so many of them. Well, still, they were deceptive at best, dishonest at worst, and they gave real estate a bad rap. So which one this was, I don't know, but it was probably in the same vein. Yes?
You mentioned Ben Shaw's.
Excuse me?
You mentioned Ben Shaw's,
Ben Shaw?
the artist.
I didn't mention him.
Oh, that's what I mean, he's not in the book.
He's not in the book, and actually he's not near the shore. While he is a major Monmouth County artistic figure, Roosevelt is, well off the shore. Yeah. But we do have Roosevelt on the Weekend at Old Monmouth tour, and one of the major features there is the Great Sean mural. Anyone else? Yes?
You mentioned the physics state. And my daughter and I have been there many times, and to put your mind at rest, they do say he never practiced.
Oh, they do? Well, that's good.
They do say he inherited his money, but they don't admit that he closed banks down.
Well, it was late in his career. The bank was not particularly successful, so it was one bank, singular. He was also greatly interested in fair treatment of animals, and sometimes would take matters into his own hands in that respect.
Thank you very much, Randy. I think it's been a very interesting presentation. I want you to know that Randy is a great supporter of our museum. I don't think there's an event that we've ever had that he doesn't show up for. On the historical commission, he's been very positive about our museum, so it's really great to have him here. One other thing I want to mention, we have the Garfield at the shore presidents, and you may have noticed, she looks terrific right now. Lucretia Garfield is in the back. She lives at the museum, otherwise known as Heather McDonald. Thank you for coming, and we have refreshments in the back. Thanks very much.